Right now is one of the best times of the year to scout for deer, but a lot of people struggle with what to actually look for while scouting. They might be able to identify deer sign, but they're really unsure what it actually means or how to build a strategy around it for the fall. If this sounds like you, or you get overwhelmed with where to even start scouting a new piece of property, buckle up, this video is for you. Let's start off by reviewing some deer habit basics. And deer are crepuscular, which basically is a fancy way of saying that they're most active at dawn and at dusk. And during most of the daylight hours, deer are going to be confined to the safety of their bedding areas. And while they're not laying around all day long, they do get up and mill around a little bit. Generally, they're going to stay in that security cover. Sometime around dusk, they're going to stand up out of their beds, move off to whatever the food sources are in the area, feed off and on throughout the night, and then in the mornings return back to those bedding areas. So this travel from point A to point B allows us bow hunters a great opportunity to intercept them and try to get a shot. So while we're out here today, one of the main objectives is going to be trying to figure out where the deer are bedding and where they're feeding. There are secondary patterns that we try to figure out, especially during the rut. Bucks will cruise trying to scent check doe bedding areas, trying to find a doe that's ready to be bred. And there's ways that they travel that allows them to cover a large area super efficiently, and with a little bit of knowledge we can anticipate these movements and set up and try to get a shot. These patterns still primarily focus on bedding, so you can start to see why it is so critical that we figure out where they're bedding, both the does and the bucks. With all of that to set the stage, it can still be daunting to step foot on a brand new property not really knowing where to begin. And ideally you would have done some type of cyber scouting ahead of time on the Onxhunt app, and if you're in a mixed ag area and you can figure out where the ag fields are, those are generally a great place to start. On the piece of public we're scouting today, we're lucky enough to have ag on the public, but if you don't have ag on the public you're scouting, maybe there's some adjacent private land food sources, whether it's an apple orchard or crop fields that you can kind of get near and then work your way back to the bedding onto the public. Or sometimes if there's not a clear destination food source, you just have to kind of jump into the field using your gut, and you're going to scout your way and try to figure out where the bedding is and where the food is along the way. But for now, we're gonna start at the food source and work our way back to the bedding. And there's gonna be several things that we're looking for. We're looking for tracks, especially big tracks. We're looking for rubs, we're looking for scrapes, hopefully some shed antlers, but I doubt it. And then obviously we're looking for beds. In addition to that, since this is public land, we're also looking for sign of other hunters. And what that might look like is trash, trail markers, cat eyes, trimmed branches from where they're going up into the tree to hunt, tree stands, trail cameras. It's pretty obvious. And along the way, as we find these things, we're gonna mark them all on the Onxhunt app, and that's gonna help us store everything, stay really organized for our future trips out here, whether it's hunting or scouting further. I just worked my way out of the field a little bit and I already found just an absolute slammer rub. And you can tell this has been there for a while, but it kind of looks like a perennial, like a rubbing post that probably gets hit by every buck that walks by it, because in the middle it looks old, but on the outside there's like fresher red, like maybe from earlier this fall. There's no shavings on top of the leaves, but I'm gonna mark this, and that's generally a good sign that there's at least good bucks in the area. Being this close to the food, I'm not putting a ton of stock in it yet, but I am thinking that maybe I'll follow this specific trail back and maybe it'll lead to some magnum buck bedding. Let's see. There's basically just a little strip of timber in between where I came from, that cornfield, and the marsh, and there's a really big trail through here and a really big trail that goes off into the marsh. I do see a tree stand. I won't show it because I'm not trying to spot burn if somebody does like hunting there. A little bit of a bummer. I'm not surprised. Usually the most obvious places have tree stands set up, and a lot of times they get hunted, but just because there's a tree stand there, it's still public land, and maybe that person has 10 different stands and maybe they don't get out to hunt much. And if you can sneak out during the week or whatever, maybe you can get a couple hunts in without having somebody intrude. But I'm just gonna hug the edge of this marsh. There's just an awesome trail that I can't really ignore. There's all these honey locust trees. I don't see many of the pods on the ground, which probably means they've been getting ate up. Just want to see if maybe we'll find an antler laying out here. All right, I just saw another tree stand in real close proximity. This is the first major chunk of cover right off the ag fields, closest to the access. All that tells me is I got to get a little bit further from the access, maybe get in some slightly less obvious places. But judging by that rub and hopefully more rubs like it, tells me that there's big bucks in the area despite the pressure. It's just a matter of getting on them and hunting around the pressure. But where I'm at right now, I'm about 20 yards from one stand and 100 yards from another. So I'm gonna kind of pivot and jump around a lot of the stuff instead of wasting my time spending a bunch of time figuring out an area that is getting heavily hunted. So on the train of trying to get into some less obvious places, I'm checking out this area is just a sea of marsh grass, and I'm still not far from the food. And one thing that you can look for to help identify deer bedding and buck bedding is structure. Structure out in the middle of a marsh, in the middle of a swamp. Anytime there's trees or some of this big woody, shrubby stuff, there's generally enough high, dry ground for deer to bed. Otherwise, these plants wouldn't be able to grow there. So there is some beds in here. It's kind of hard to see with the grass all laying over, but there's also a lot of rubs. So I'm still not super convinced that this is an area I need to spend a lot of time, but putting little puzzle pieces together, I'll mark these down as beds. But if I did determine that this is a place I need to hunt or just look into further, there's a couple different ways I could go about figuring this area out. The first one, and the one that I most likely would be doing, is some type of observation hunt. There is trees on most sides of where I'm at right now. I'd probably just jump in a tree and watch whatever deer come out of these bedding areas out to the egg. And if it's a buck that I'm interested in, I'd try to figure out a way to put myself in between where he's bedding and where he's going, whether that's getting in a tree or setting up on the ground, which is something I'm trying to do a lot more of now, because a lot of places where these bucks travel is away from trees, because I think they realize that all the pressure is around where the obvious trees are. So just one start to the mission today on some potential bedding. We're gonna mark it down and we're gonna keep going. One of the things we're looking for is tracks or deer trails, and some of these are absolutely beat down. And the marsh and the swamps, they can be kind of intimidating because of the vastness of them, but the one huge advantage you have is generally the trails are very, very obvious. They're usually really beat down where these deer are traveling on a daily basis. And these heavy trails, they might just be doe family groups traveling from bed to feed every single day, and that's why they're so obvious. And the buck trails might actually be a little less obvious. It at least gives us a good indication of a preferred food source and a general travel direction, whether or not the bedding is exactly the same for all of them. Wait till you see this bed. Super cool. Like I just talked about, deer looking for structure. They need some type of shade and cover out here in the marsh. They're not just gonna bed in the middle of the grass. Generally, they want some type of tree or shrub, something that's gonna provide shade and cover. But look at, get all the way back here. Just an awesome bed. Oh man. A bunch of hair in there. Decent sized bed. I don't think it's like a freaking giant deer, but pretty cool. There's also another bed on the front here, and subtle things like this grass. All of this grass is nipped off at the end, so standing up from its bed, browsing around a little bit, eating a little bit of green that there is, and is probably able to see any approaching danger from where we access to, and has a lot of escape routes. You'd probably never even know that this buck was here. Pretty neat. So this bed's pretty obvious. We found the bed, there's hair in it, there's an adjacent ag field, so it's pretty clear that it's going from bed to feed in a relatively short distance. So how do you kill this deer? For one, is it even a deer you want to kill? Maybe there's a doe bedding here, maybe there's a doe family group bedding here. I'd go back to the observation sit if that's an option for you. I'd be doing an observation sit and seeing if there's a deer in here that I'm interested in pursuing, and also be able to see how the deer exits the bed, where exactly it goes. Then based off of that information, if there's a tree that the deer walks by, I'd be trying to set up in that tree if the wind is right. If that's not an option, I'd be trying to set up on the ground within shooting distance. Another method you could do to evaluate if this is a deer you want to kill and how to go about killing it is the use of trail cameras, obviously. There's not a great place to run cameras in here. When this grass is 6 foot high, 4 foot high, and you can't see anything except for grass blowing around in front of your camera, it's not going to be super beneficial. So observation sit is probably the way I would go, or I would be setting a camera along the field edge somewhere, hopefully on a scrape, and you could generally tell if that buck is hitting that scrape relatively close to daylight on either end. Got to be bedding close, and if this is one of the better beds in the area, that's probably where it's going to be. So a couple ways to go about it, or you could just take a stab at it and set up between this bed and the field and kill the deer or not. Having a little bit of intel to complement your efforts is generally beneficial, but so far very encouraged. Another type of structure in the marsh or the swamp is any type of high ground. So on this side of the river here, there's this high spot, and I'm gonna walk it quick and see if there's any sheds because it is in close proximity to a food source, and maybe a buck's in there right now. But honestly, the tracks I'm finding around here for the most part are small. So I would imagine that these high areas would be advantageous positions for multiple does, like a doe family group, to bed and then just go out to the field in the evenings. So I'm guessing that's probably the case. There is remnants, some old bigger tracks, so you never know, but we'll poke around in here. And when you get into a spot like this, it's not as simple as just walking up and doing a quick glance and saying, yep, there's a bed, or yep, there's a rub or a scrape. I'm gonna spend, I don't know how big this area is, probably 40 yards by 50 yards, and I might poke around in here for 10 minutes and look for specific beds, look for rubs, look for antlers, all that good stuff before I make a general consensus about what's actually happening here. It's about taking in all this information, making the best guess you can as to how the deer are actually utilizing this area, and then from there trying to figure out how you can use that information to kill a deer. And if we did determine through whatever means that this is a doe bedding area and only does bed here all year round, not a buck. We're not just gonna scratch this area off the map. Like we talked about in the beginning, there's certain ways that bucks travel through the landscape to scent check for hot does around the rut. And we might mark this as a doe bedding area and then take a look at a broader view of this spot and say, okay, if I was a buck and the wind's blowing whatever particular way, how would he be scent checking this area, and then how can I set up to anticipate that and get a shot? So that's also something I want to be looking for as I'm putzing around, as I like to say, just checking out this area. So I just scouted my way back onto this high point, and here's a bed with a rub right next to it. Could mean that it's a buck bed. It's not an enormous bed, but if you look in the bed closely, it took a little bit of scratching around. There's a decent amount of hair, and these leaves were pretty well compressed. There's not an absolute ton of hair, so I don't think they're laying here right now and shedding their winter coats like I would imagine is happening in a lot of beds right now, but there's some smaller rubs around this area. My guess is this is a buck that's bedding here maybe earlier in the season, and that's why the hair that I am finding is below the leaves and hitting that egg. And then once pressure picks up, or once some of this grass gets knocked down, maybe he's out of here. I'm gonna keep exploring this area. I've barely gotten started, seeing if maybe there's a bigger, better bed that a mature buck would be bedding in, and this is just a satellite bed and not always getting used. If you want to see how deer survive in such a highly pressured area like I'm in, check out this bed. It's literally just a little nest in there, surrounded by all sides. Pretty good size. That's pretty cool. And clearly in there right now because all this grass is matted down from the snow and whatnot, and there's poop on top of all that. So far, what I've determined is that all along the edge of this marsh, there's just a lot of beds in general. Bucks and does, I'm sure. It's gonna take some further scouting come season to really nail it down. One, I'd be in here checking out what size tracks I'm finding, and I'd also be doing those observations probably even in late summer, so I can crack as early in season as possible before they get overly pressured. So that's good. It's not always like this where you jump right into the public and start finding a lot of beds, but every property has unique challenges and unique situations, and in this place it might not be super difficult to find a deer, but trying to kill a deer and trying to kill a specific buck at that in the midst of all the other deer, like how do I get close to that one buck without spooking all these other deer trying to access? That's what we're trying to figure out. Sometimes that's not the case. Sometimes there's a really low deer density and you locate a buck bed, and that might be the only deer you encounter the whole time you're hunting. But right now is the time to do this because, as you can see, if this will focus or not, leaves are budding out. Green up is beginning. Once all this stuff is green and thick and everything's covered in thorns and poison ivy, good luck. You're gonna have a really difficult time. So if you can at least put some of the initial pieces in place February, March, April, out while you're turkey hunting. Just a couple hours here and there is gonna make all the difference. All right, I'm on the off side of this little high area that I found that bed on and a couple other beds surrounding it. And although this marsh grass is really not conducive for scraping, the first thing I noticed was this licking branch. You can see that hanging there, but there is actually a scrape on the ground. So this might be a place where I run a camera on this fence post or this other tree and try to get inventory of how often bucks are hitting that scrape, if they're in there every day going back to bed right there, or if it's only once a week as they're scent checking looking for does, and also get a gauge of what bucks are in the area, so that way I can start figuring out if I'm trying to target a certain caliber of buck, if the buck I'm after is even in this area. A lot of times scouting and hunting is just crossing things off the map. On that note, what I've been guilty of that has led me astray for years, and I'm trying to do a lot better, is not just scouting and figuring all this stuff out, but actually picking out a tree to hunt out of, a kill tree, and an access point. Those two things are critical. You can have a property dialed, know where every single bed and every single buck is, and every single scrape is, and every single rub is, but if you don't know what tree you can get in to kill, or where you can actually ambush these deer, and you don't know how you can get in without actually scaring away all the deer you're trying to kill, or other deer that might bump into the buck that you're trying to kill, it's not gonna do you any good. So while we're in here today, the thing I always say is, oh, when I come back in the summer, I'll figure that out, or when I come back later, I'll figure that out. A lot of times I don't get back to these areas until it's hunting season. So while I'm here right now, I see a tree right behind me. Maybe I could slip into early in the morning while these deer are coming back to bed and be able to shoot right to this scrape. I don't know if that's the best answer. The access looks a little bit tricky there, so I need to spend a little bit of time and figure that out. But if you can do these things in the off season, when everything is dead and knocked down and open, and you can figure out where you need to hunt and pick the exact tree. And I'm going to the point of going to the base of these trees, clearing out all the dead branches and all the brush that's laying at the bottom of these trees, so when I arrive in the dark, possibly, I can climb those trees as quiet as possible. So those are just massive keys. Look at this big crossing right here. X marks the spot. But yeah, those are the biggest. If you could take away one thing from this video, regardless of your scouting efforts, when you're in there actually scouting and you find a place that you want to hunt, pick the tree and figure out the access while you're there, right then and there. Mark all of that on Onx, because you're going to forget if you try to base all of that on memory, and you're going to have a lot more success in the fall when you actually get in there to hunt. Man, I'm getting into some spots that there's lots of beds, lots of fresh sign. Like, I feel like I ought to be finding an antler in here, just because bucks are finally starting to drop antlers where I'm at in Ohio, and they probably have for a little bit now. There's some that are holding. We're relatively close proximity to food, lots of good bedding, lots of fresh sign. Feel like that's a recipe for some bone. Nothing would make me more excited than finding a giant shed antler. And I'm not a big shed hunter, but one thing that shed hunting does is gives you an idea of what bucks are in the area, what bucks made it through season, so you can kind of plan accordingly for next year and maybe have some targets already pre-identified. All right, I want to show you one more bed here that's a little bit different than the other ones. The other ones were more based on shrubs or high spots in the marsh. Here, I got these giant trees all come together, and you can see this depression in the grass where this deer is able to lay with all this stuff at its back, watch everything out in front of it, and be protected. There's some other smaller beds around, so my guess this is probably some doe bedding. But like right here, it's not super matted. I don't think these deer bed here often, but there's also poop right there too. I'll note it down. Probably not put a ton of stock into this being a doe bedding area that I'm gonna anticipate bucks cruising downwind of in the rut, but at least something to be aware of. All you can do is take in all this information, make the best guesses you can with the information you have at hand, and see what happens. I think of bow hunting as science. You make a hypothesis, you have certain information, you form a hypothesis of what you think is happening or what you think is going to happen, and then you test your hypothesis. And my goal with that, just like in science, is to control the variables as much as possible. So I'm trying to get in and out as clean as possible. I'm trying not to impact the area or leave a bunch of scent behind in season. I'm trying to find areas that other people aren't going to be bombing through, which on public land, you never know. But some of these less obvious places might not get the same pressure. So what you have then is deer being deer, and you making your hypothesis and testing them until eventually you are right. The best part about it is you only have to be right once, and a lot of times there's luck involved. Sometimes it takes a coyote bumping a buck out of its bed early, or another hunter blowing deer out of its bedding area, and they end up where you're at. But you make these hypotheses, you test them, you get right one time. That's all you need to make your whole season. We'll do a little bit of shed hunting on our way out here, but today we found some rubs, found some scrapes, found lots of beds. We figured out what the primary food source is and picked out some trees that will be able to intersect from point A to point B. So hopefully this was helpful if you're the type of person that does not have ag ground in your area or on the properties that you have access to hunt. Sometimes it takes just getting in there, finding any kind of concentration of sign, and then working forward or backwards to determine what the food sources are and where the bedding is. And sometimes in areas where the food source is less defined, maybe it's a couple oak flats, maybe it's more natural browse, the sign's going to be less concentrated and the travel direction is going to be less defined, which makes it a little bit more challenging, but it's not impossible. But hopefully this helped you guys. Make sure you like this video, subscribe to my channel. It's going to be a fun season, and I'm excited to bring you guys along the way.